All right. Welcome to Alwan for the Arts. Alwan for the Arts is a center that promotes Middle Eastern arts and culture, and when we say Middle East, it's a broad definition. I'd like to welcome the author, Arun Kundani, and somebody who's going to moderate the talk, Tariq Ismail. Tariq Ismail is a human rights lawyer.
Yeah, I'll just take a few seconds to give an introduction to Arun. Arun, for those of you who don't know, is liable to pop up at any university across town and teach a class there. He has been an Open Society Fellow, a Fellow at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and is the author of this incredible book, which I first read assuming it was about dinner at my grandmother's house. But it actually is incredible, and I've spent years myself doing research on domestic counterterrorism prosecutions and learned all kinds of new things by reading this book. So I commend it to all of you, and I can't wait to hear from Arun tonight. So without further ado, Arun.
Thank you all very much for coming. So as you can tell, I have an English accent. Those of us who come from London, we tend to do this thing of not pronouncing our TH sounds very well. So they come out like Fs. If I say a word like ruthless, I'm not talking about a building without a roof. So bear with me. I'm going to try and avoid the word theology. That might come up. So a bit about the background to the book. So in 2011, I spent a year traveling around the United States, spending some time in New York, in Minnesota, Virginia, Texas, Michigan, doing interviews with FBI agents who work on counterterrorism, with local police departments, security officials in the Department of Homeland Security, National Security Council, and community activists working on issues of extremism. And I interviewed a number of people who've been labeled as Islamic extremists in the United States. And I spent some time doing similar kinds of interviews in England as well. So the book I've written comes out of that period of research. A lot of the book is narrative, telling kind of personal stories, describing the experiences of people who've been on the receiving end of surveillance, profiling, suspicion. But what I'm going to start us off by doing is by talking about some of the words in the title. Okay, so first off, there's this word Islamophobia in the title, right? I'd like to just start there. So, and the word is a controversial word, right? It's by no means straightforward or an easy word to make use of, in my opinion. And it's sometimes seen as just this kind of recurring virus of hatred in Western culture that goes back to the Crusades. Others kind of see it as a sort of spontaneous reaction to 9/11, and one that will kind of fade away as that event recedes into history. Many people say the concept doesn't make sense, or the reality that it's meant to refer to does not exist. So my emphasis is on Islamophobia as a kind of as a form of structural racism directed at Muslims, right? And the ways in which that's sustained through a symbiotic relationship with the official thinking and practices of the war on terror. So its significance does not lie in just in the individual prejudices that it generates, but in its wider political consequences, right? The enabling of systematic violations of the rights of Muslims. The war on terror, with its kind of vast death toll in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Pakistan, Yemen, could not be sustained without some kind of racialized dehumanization, right, of its victims. Now, the usual objection to defining Islamophobia in this way is that Muslims are not a race, right? But since all racisms are socially and historically constructed, rather than resting on the reality of any biological thing called race, it's perfectly possible for cultural markers associated with Muslimness, such as forms of dress, rituals, languages, etc., to be turned into racial signifiers, right? So this is what I see as the racialization of Muslimness that's analogous in important ways to anti-Semitism and is inseparable from the kind of wider history of racism in the United States. So if you think about anti-Semitism as a comparison here, what anti-Semitism does in the 19th century when it gets going is it racializes Jews. It turns a whole load of people who share a religion into a race, right? And at the center of anti-Semitism is the Jewish conspiracy theory, right? The idea that there's a secret cabal of Jews who are manipulating world events to their advantage, right? And at the same time, as well as this kind of super elite who are pulling the strings of world events, is Jews as the kind of underclass that's corrupting society from below. So anti-Semitism has that double structure, right? And in fact, all racisms have that double structure, right? Racialized immigrants are always, always lazy, but also working really hard and therefore stealing our jobs. Racialized immigrants are always keeping themselves to themselves and not integrating into society, but also secretly infiltrating mainstream society, right? So you always have this double thing going on. So then Islamophobia is actually very similar to anti-Semitism, right? In the sense that we have, again, the return of this conspiracy theory where the doubling is about an elite power and a subclass, right? So with Islamophobia, the most powerful man in the world is secretly involved in a conspiracy to impose Sharia law on the United States, right? It's exactly the same as the Jewish conspiracy theory. Corruption from above and below is the model, right? Now, to define Islamophobia in that way does not imply that critiques of Islamic belief are automatically to be condemned as racially motivated. It does mean opposing the kind of social and political processes by which antipathy to Islam is acted out in violent attacks on the street or institutionalized in state structures, counterterrorism policy, violations of civil rights, and so on. Okay, so there's the second word in the title is the idea of extremism, right? And I'm not going to get into that too much, but bound up in this idea of extremism is the idea that there's some relationship between religion and violence. Okay, so in the war on terror, we've seen this repeatedly played out, a kind of debate going on between conservatives and liberals, right? So the conservatives argue that Islam is a violent religion, it's a religion that's incompatible with democracy, incompatible with modernity. And then you have a kind of liberal reply that says, no, Islam is a religion of peace, it's not inherently violent, but there's some minority who misinterpret Islam in an extremist fashion, right? So then you have this liberal conservative debate that goes on. Each side trades quotations from the Quran and from the classical sources, which inevitably is a kind of, does violence to the text in terms of taking things out of context and so forth. And the debate doesn't really go anywhere. Things are never settled in this debate. And this goes on and on. This is what we've seen since 9/11. The point for me is that both sides in this debate assume that Islamic theology is fundamentally relevant, right, in either causing violence or preventing it, right? So the real meaning of the debate is not what either side says in that, but this hidden assumption that Islamic ideology is the key to understanding why terrorism happens. Okay? And the argument I make in the book is that Islamic theology is largely irrelevant in trying to understand the causes of terrorism. Right? And that almost seems like a perverse thing to say because it's become common sense to think otherwise. Right? But that common sense has been constructed over the last 20 years or so at least. Right? And so we need to kind of unpack how that has become common sense. What is the process there? And at least over the last 10 years, the way that I argue that's happened is through this concept of radicalization, right? The radicalization has become the chief lens through which Western societies now view Muslim populations, right? This is true on both sides of the Atlantic. So-called terrorism experts have advanced theories of radicalization that claim to be able to identify individuals who are not terrorists now, but might be at some later date. Okay, that's what these models of radicalization attempt to do. But how do you identify tomorrow's terrorists today, right? And so here I think it's worth thinking about Steven Spielberg's 2002 film Minority Report, in which you have a specialist pre-crime unit that's imagined as using these three psychics called precogs to predict who will be the murderers in the future, right? And the unit is then able to arrest pre-criminals before they've committed the crimes for which they are convicted. Okay? And this is similar to how the war on terror functions. We have the same kind of idea, this kind of preventative approach to terrorism. And in place of precogs who have some capability to predict the future, instead we have security officials turning to academic models that claim scientific knowledge of a process by which ordinary Muslims are supposed to become terrorists, right? So these models of radicalization claim that there are certain behavioral, cultural, and ideological signals that can reveal who's at risk of turning into a terrorist at some point in the future. So in the FBI's radicalization model, for example, there's 4 stages that someone goes through on their way to becoming a terrorist, so-called pre-radicalization, identification, indoctrination, and action. In the second stage of this process, some of the indicators that are listed by the FBI are such things as growing a beard, starting to wear traditional Islamic clothing, becoming alienated from one's former life, right? When you're in stage 3, which is 1 stage away from becoming an active terrorist, one of the indicators is increased activity in a pro-Muslim social group or political cause. Okay? Now, what's significant about these radicalization models that have come from academia but have filtered into law enforcement agencies is that they all assume that some form of religious ideology is the root cause of terrorism, right? So over the last decade, we've actually seen millions of dollars spent by the US government to try and prove this link between religious ideology and terrorist violence. And when you look at that scientific work, that academic work that's been attempting to do that, which is something I do in my book, you just see that it doesn't stand up to scrutiny, okay? In the film Minority Report, the precogs unit is eventually shut down when its fallibility is revealed, but we still have these bogus scientific models driving how we understand terrorism and how we try and police it. And what's more, it's because government officials and so-called terrorism experts have repeatedly invoked this concept of radicalization, it's become part of our everyday language, right? So nowadays when you read the newspapers and watch television about terrorism, this word radicalization is always there, right? Whenever we're looking at what's happening in Syria now or terrorism around the world, this word radicalization is always there. It's become part of our everyday language. We never used this word 15 years ago to understand terrorism, okay? So, and that has embedded this kind of assumption that the root cause of terrorism is some kind of Islamic ideology. When you look at the evidence, having a belief in extremist Islam, however you want to define that, if you want to define that, does not correlate with involvement in terrorism very well at all, right? So there might well be many good reasons for objecting to reactionary interpretations of religion, but the idea that religious ideology mechanically causes terrorism to happen is not one of them, right? And what this official narrative of radicalization leaves out is the role of our own government's foreign policy in fostering political contexts within which terrorism becomes more likely, right? So religion might provide the kind of semantic register within which some terrorists articulate their propaganda, but it's politics that is the underlying cause, right? So if you think about Hamas, Hamas uses religious language to legitimize its violence. It also uses religious language to legitimize its ceasefires. Right? So it's not the religious component that's driving its decision to use violence or not in a particular context. To understand its decision-making, you have to understand the political history of Israel's military occupation, right? And that's consistent with the whole history of terrorism in the modern era, right? So you think about that history, terrorism occurs not because of political radicalization, but actually out of failures of political radicalization, right? Terrorism emerges in moments of political defeat. So you think about the first example of modern terrorism is the anarchist bombers in the late 19th century. They all are veterans of the violent suppression of the Paris Commune, okay? Comes out of a moment of political defeat. Think about the point in the round about the late 60s when the Provisional IRA begins its campaign of bombing in Northern Ireland, right? It's come out of the violent suppression of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, right? Think about the Weather Underground in the early 1970s when it declares its declaration of war against the US government, right? It's come out of the violent suppression of the student movement to end the Vietnam War, right? And the failure of that movement to achieve its ends in a non-violent way. And then think about our own time. If you look at Britain, from 2003 to 2006, the number of terrorism-related convictions more than doubles in Britain, right? And then from 2006 to 2009, it goes back down to the level it was at before. Now, that's not entirely due to the fact that the British government joined the Iraq War in 2003, but that's a big part of it, right? So, you know, in 2003, we have millions of people on the streets in London trying to say that we should not be part of this war. With that number of people on the streets, there's an optimism that maybe in a democracy that should have some effect on government policy. It doesn't. It's a moment of political defeat, and that sets the context within which a small number of people decide that now it becomes legitimate to carry out violence against fellow civilians. Okay, so it's not that those people have been radicalized in their religious ideology, right? They haven't changed their religious interpretation of anything. What's happened is that they have been exposed to the news from Iraq, the carnage in Iraq, where hundreds of thousands of people are dying, right? This idea of radicalization, with all its flaws, has shaped all kinds of policy implications, right? So if you think that some kind of religious ideology is the root cause of terrorism, then you're going to want a counter-terrorism strategy that involves putting the religious opinions of Muslims under systematic surveillance, right? So that you look out for these ideological warning signs that you think are predictors of a potential terrorist, right? And that's what we've seen both in the United States and in England, right? So in the United States, we have, as of 2008, 15,000 paid informants working for the FBI, right? And we don't know what proportion are focused on Muslim communities in America, but given that roughly half of the FBI's budget is dedicated to counterterrorism, and given that how the FBI defines counterterrorism is very much focused on Muslims, it's reasonable to assume that half of those paid informants, I think, are based in Muslim communities. And we know from some of the prosecutions that have emerged that those paid informants are operating in mosques, in Muslim student associations, in community organizations. We know that at least 100,000 Muslims in America have had some kind of national security file created about them. Now, and we know over the last couple of years we've learned a lot about similar practices that the New York Police Department has of running informants, of this kind of systematic surveillance of the everyday life of Muslims in the tri-state area. So in trying to understand what's going on here, it's worth thinking about some historical comparisons. So under the communist government in East Germany, the Stasi, this is kind of one of our familiar images of totalitarianism, police state. The Stasi was estimated to have had one spy for every 66 citizens in East Germany. Okay, so and those spies were a combination of informants or intelligence analysts working in the Stasi. So if we look at the numbers that we have working for the FBI in one way or another, my kind of estimate of how many FBI spies there are per Muslims in America, I think there's an FBI spy for every 94 Muslims in the United States, right? And that's before one adds the resources of the National Security Agency, the regional intelligence fusion centers, which is another arm of the national security apparatus, the counterterrorism resources of local police departments like in New York, which means that Muslims in the United States are likely to be exposed to similar levels of surveillance that East Germans were experiencing under the Stasi, right? We start to see some other familiar things from the history of totalitarianism, right? So we've had over the last couple of years people discovering that that someone they thought was a friend was actually someone who was working as an informant for the New York Police Department, right? So you have that moment of realizing that some of your personal relationships were based on this deception, which is very similar to the experience that East Germans had when the Stasi files were opened in the early 90s, and people started to realize that someone they trusted was actually spying on them, right? We're starting to get those kinds of experiences, the experience of business owners discovering that they're on an NYPD file that's gathering intelligence about their everyday lives, the things they say, right? And then when you look at the typical cases of terrorist prosecutions, over the last decade, a substantial proportion of those terrorist prosecutions in the United States have involved a process where someone's identified not for being involved in any kind of terrorist plot that's active of any kind, but people who are being identified for their ideology, right, for the religious and political opinions they express, and then informants and undercover agents are being placed in that person's life as agents provocateurs, right? So in all these cases, someone working for the FBI provides not only the plan, but also the means and opportunity for whatever alleged crimes take place. And in many cases, it appears FBI agents provocateurs are able to manipulate vulnerable people with mental health problems or drug addiction problems into conspiring in kind of manufactured plots that they would otherwise not have been predisposed to. So to a large degree, the FBI is kind of fantasizing into existence the very threat of domestic Muslim terrorism that it claims to be fighting. The only radicalization taking place in these cases is the FBI's own. So, and then when you add to that the material support prosecutions, right, where someone in a much more direct way is being criminalized for their expressive activity, the things they say, their communications online and so forth, right? Because we've widened the definition of what material support for terrorism means now to include speech, not just active, not just active incitement or active financing. And then in the United Kingdom, we have a similar picture in some ways in terms of the underlying thinking, but a slightly different approach. If you like, a more subtle approach, but equally indecent. So since the 7/7 terrorist attacks on the London transport system in 2005, we've created an elaborate system of surveillance that draws on social workers, teachers, youth workers into collecting information about the lives of young Muslims for the supposed signs of radicalization, right? So one police officer that I spoke with who's involved in this program told me that children as young as 4 could be radicalizing, right? And that nursery school teachers, so teachers who are teaching kids of that age, should therefore report children who draw pictures of bombs in their notebooks, okay? And as of 2010, 290 children under 16 had been reported to the police in this way, and their lives investigated by police counter-terrorist units. And since then, almost 2,500 people have been identified through this program, which is known as the Channel Project. And it's worth pointing out that this Channel Project is by definition being used to intervene in the lives of people who are not suspected of any criminal activity, right? So in the book, I write about the case of someone called Jamil Scott, who's a 17-year-old student from Manchester in England, which is, I think, the first time that one of the cases through this Channel Project has been publicly documented. He'd not committed any crime, but because he was involved in a political protest against a lecture by the Israeli deputy ambassador, the police attempted a de-radicalization program with him that involved police officers trying to get his family and teachers to persuade him to stop being politically active, and also trying to gather intelligence on his political associates and their activities. Okay, so in trying to make sense of this, I think particularly around the question of extremism, I actually think Martin Luther King is one of the kind of deepest thinkers on this question. So if you remember his letter from Birmingham jail, he writes that letter because he's been accused of being an extremist by other Christians, right, for taking his stand on civil rights. And he writes there that at first he was disappointed to have this label attached to him. But then after a while, he says he embraced the label, right? And he says, I am an extremist. And then, as he puts it, I'm an extremist for love and an extremist for justice. So he does something very interesting there around refusing the terms on which his political opponents are labeling him and trying to transcend that framework and appropriate it for a different politics. And then later on, in 1967, he's speaking at an audience at Riverside Church in uptown Manhattan. And at this point, he's been spending time with young African Americans, trying to persuade them to pursue a non-violent approach, right, to bringing about political change. And they replied to him, well, are you also preaching non-violence to our government, right? And he says it was impossible to condemn without hypocrisy the violence of angry young men within America unless one also condemned the state violence of our own government. So he says, I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government, right? And so I think this is a point that's very interesting because what he's doing there is pointing to the circular relationship, right, between state violence and non-state violence. So we like to focus on non-state violence and separate that out and think of state violence as just normal, rational, necessary. And he's saying, no, there's a circular thing here, right? And let's start with the greater violence that states cause. And that seems to me a point that's as valid today in the era of the war on terror's kind of global battlefield. So I think it's time once again to kind of heed King's message here and update it for the war on terror and unravel the kind of racisms and totalitarianisms that it's fostered. So thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
So I do want to take questions from the audience, but I'm going to invoke my moderator's privilege here and ask the first one. Arun, I wanted to talk to you about why you think this engagement is happening, and how you think that engagement is happening on a global scale, because I think that a lot of what you're talking about here domestically can also be applied to a lot of the U.S. government's policies abroad, whether it's in occupation in Iraq formerly or Afghanistan, or the use of drones and how drones are manipulated against particular targets in Pakistan and elsewhere. So I wonder if you see it as kind of a spectrum of the same policy, or if they're different policies, or what?
Right. So, one of the things I'm interested in the book is some of the kind of ways that the techniques and ways of thinking that have been practiced in other contexts outside the United States kind of come back into the domestic context, right? So, when I spent some time I interviewed some of the FBI officers working on counterterrorism in the Houston, Texas field office, and one of the things that you get to do is they take you into their kind of counterterrorism control room, right, which they're very proud of. It's got all these big computer screens on the wall, and it's they like to kind of show off their latest tech gadgets and so forth. So but the thing I noticed about being in that room was when you look at the wall, you see a series of clocks with all the different time zones in the United States, and then you see a clock with the current time in Iraq and a clock with the current time in Afghanistan, right? So the FBI there is meant to be a domestic counterterrorist law enforcement agency, but in its in the way it organises its sense of how it sees itself, it's clearly seeing itself as linked into what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? And about a third of the officers working on counterterrorism in that field office were had experience in the US military before they joined the FBI to do counterterrorism. They'd been Marines, most of them. So one of my questions that I was kind of interested in asking those people was, how do you see the relationship between the the work you were doing in the Marines and what you do now? And the answer you tend to get is, well, I feel like there's a lot of transferable skills there, right? Because what I was doing in the Marines when I was in Somalia was counterinsurgency work, where I try and build relationships with what they would call tribal leaders, sit down, have a cup of tea with them, and what I do in Houston, Texas is build relationships with the tribal leaders. That would be the phrase, right? Which means, you know, the kind of local Muslim businessmen, right? So you see these kind of practices, ways of thinking coming back and being applied domestically in exactly the same way that they might be applied overseas. Now, you mentioned drone strikes. You know, another kind of way in which there's this kind of constant to and fro between the foreign and the domestic is actually around drone strikes. So the official reason that that the White House carried out the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki was because he was accused by the White House of being a senior leader in Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. There doesn't seem to be much compelling evidence that was the case. We only have the White House's statement to go on to back that up. And when you look at the whole case, it seems to me much more likely that the reason that he was a victim of a drone strike is because he was interpreted as someone who was radicalizing Muslims in the West, right? So actually the policy was directed at ending the message, the propagandizing that he was doing for an audience within Europe and the United States. And so again, and so, you know, what's happening there is we're using extrajudicial killing against a propagandist, right? Not someone who was actually an imminent threat. But because we've adopted this idea of radicalization, that's now become a normal practice, right? Because the concept of radicalization basically blurs the distinction between speech and action, right? And so it's applied overseas just as much as it's applied domestically, for sure.
Please.
What's your method of research? How do you go about accessing information? Do you go to the Freedom of Information Act, or?
Okay. In terms of the first part of your question about my methods, I mean, so, you know, I did interviews with people who work in law enforcement. I basically did a bit of work to get access to the FBI through its press office, set up interviews with agents working on counterterrorism in different parts of the United States, did those interviews. When you do the interviews, you actually don't learn a huge amount from the interviews themselves, because bear in mind that when you interview an FBI agent, you're interviewing someone who's experienced in interrogations, right? So they don't tell you very much unless they're very, very skilled at telling you only what they want to tell you, and don't even think about trying any of those, psychological techniques to get them to open up, because they know those 10 times better than you do. What they reveal that was very useful for my book is how, one of the things that's interesting is within the FBI there is a debate going on between kind of, if you like, these labels aren't entirely accurate, but let's use them, like, between liberals and conservatives, right? There is a hardcore faction within the FBI that basically thinks Islam is the problem. Then there's a kind of liberal faction, if you want to use that word, that's basically, there's a moderate mainstream Islam and there's an extremist Islam. We need to focus on extremist Islam. We need to partner with the moderates to isolate the extremists, that kind of thinking. So they're all into building relationships with the community for that purpose, right? Now those people, when you interview them, they will tell you, they basically feel that they have a narrative that's going to be compelling to you, because they think you're an academic, you're likely to be sympathetic to their liberal take on how to do this, right? And so they tend to tell you a lot about how they see things, and that's really useful, because one of the things I do is actually critique that narrative as well. I find that kind of good Muslim, bad Muslim narrative to be also problematic. It still has some of the underlying assumptions that I critique. So, so those interviews were revealing, and then there is a certain amount of documentation out there that that has come out over the years through leaks of one sort or another, or through other journalists reporting. So to build up a picture of how federal counterterrorism works in the United States, I think is now doable just from information that's in the public domain. We don't get every piece of what's going on, but we get a good picture here.
Other questions?
But I'm also thinking about whether or not this discourse of radicalization is a way of depoliticizing these questions. Because arguably again, in the north of Ireland, the constitution of the conflict in terms of ethno-religious conflict between communities and a kind of identitarian politics and managed multiculturalism means that the core issues, the causes of the conflict, which is the partition of the island, I mean, for the IRA anyway it is, and what they would see as the occupation of the island, isn't being dealt with. So there's been a period of normalization, and I would see things escalating in many respects now. So I'm just wondering about that sort of racialization. In Ireland it's ethno-religious, and you're talking about radicalization and racialization as a way of depoliticizing, so that we can't ask if we can understand the causes of these conflicts or these responses, because understanding is seen as justification. And anyway, I'm just wondering about that. Is it a strategy of depoliticization?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, that's what the concept of radicalization does, is switches out the politics and shifts it onto a kind of cultural or religious plane, right? So instead of thinking about the political processes here, we just say this is Islamic culture, or this is Islamist extremist ideology, and therefore we rather conveniently don't have to ask any questions of our role in this conflict, right, and our government's role in the politics of that. So I think, in that sense, there is a parallel there with the history of Northern Ireland, where it was similarly misinterpreted as an ethno-religious conflict when actually it was a political conflict, right? And this is something that that a lot of the young people, particularly in England, who I interviewed, who've been on the receiving end of this stuff, actually use the word depoliticization to describe what they are experiencing, right? It's an attempt to depoliticize. It's an attempt to say, do not talk about foreign policy, right? Do not talk about civil rights. The only legitimate discourse is this discourse of anti-extremism, right? Just condemn extremism. That's the only thing you're allowed to say. You're not allowed to say anything else. And if you and so one of the interesting things here is how come when and this is true, I think, both in the United States and in Britain, when a Muslim makes a criticism of government foreign policy, it's not interpreted as a fellow citizen participating in the political process. It's interpreted as someone bringing an alien and dangerous ideology and being an extremist, right? Which is exactly depoliticization, right?
How did the break happen? Is it just a matter of looking for a new target that was in order to sustain certain budgets, or?
Okay.
Just, I mean, because we have a policy that has to have a driver behind it.
We have a policy, what, sorry?
It needs to have drivers behind it. It could have gone in different directions. So.
Right. Yeah. So I want to make my answer here a little bit more complex, right? I think it's there are certainly different political forces that shape this agenda, right? So like the ones you mentioned, there is the private security industry, which obviously has a financial incentive in pitching to the federal government contracts to do all kinds of security work, blah blah blah. There is obviously the pro-Israel lobby, which more or less consciously tries to present political events in the Middle East through this lens of Islamic extremism rather than the local politics, right? for its own kind of political purposes. You obviously have a set of institutional forces in the different national security agencies who want to talk up threats to go back to Congress to get the same funding increased every year, right? That's all correct, right? And then you have the the kind of network of far-right people who systematically are funded to promote Islamophobic messages in a very brutal way. The Pamela Gellers and the Robert Spencers and those kind of people, right? That's another kind of institutional force. Now, for me, we don't get the picture we have just by adding all those forces together, right? It doesn't add up. What you have to do, I think, is see this as an ideology, right? Rather than just the product of a number of agencies in government or interacting with government, right? It's an ideology. It's much more deeply rooted, actually, right? Because one of the questions for me is if you look at the history of this, in the 1980s you have the Jonathan Institute, right, which is an organization that Netanyahu has set up to promote a certain analysis of terrorism, right, that says terrorism is the product of Islamic extremism, right? And so you have a handful of people who are neoconservatives and right-wing Zionists who come to the United States and try and promote that message, right? And very quickly, that is a big part of how America understands terrorism. That's what we see on the evening news very quickly after they've done that. So the question is not, okay, there's this kind of group that has kind of tricked us into believing this illusion. The question for me is, yeah, but like, how come it was so easy for them to do that, right? And the reason it was so easy for them to do that is because this stuff builds on a longer history of racism in the United States and Islamophobia in the United States, right? So the messages are able to resonate, right? So I don't think there's a kind of conspiracy of of conservative political players who sit down and say, let's say all this stuff about Muslims to so that our friends in business can make more money in the security industry, and so that we can have wars and stuff like that. I think that might happen, but in order for them to get away with that, there has to be a much wider set of ideological forces in our society, right? That provides the opportunity for that to happen, right? So I think I'm much more interested in the ways in which this circulates more widely in society, not just these kind of top-down forces that come from government, but the ease with which this circulates in society. And I think it's ultimately it's to do with we need, when you have a situation, say a few years ago, where the American public had been told that the US military were going to walk into Iraq and be welcomed, right? And then fairly soon, that is not the story. So there has to be some explanation for why that didn't happen, right? The American people kind of wanted some answers to why that didn't happen, right? And the real answers are to do with all the deceptions that led up to the Iraq War, right? But if you don't want to talk about those deceptions because that's uncomfortable and inconvenient, because it raises questions about our government, what do? You say, well, there's a problem of Islamist extremism that's corrupted the situation, blah, 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 Al-Qaeda in Iraq, blah, 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 and you tell that kind of story instead, and you say there's this kind of global problem of Islamic extremism. This is the Tony Blair response, right? So I think it's those kinds of things that lie behind this, and then ultimately you're talking about the fact that we have a global empire, right? And so if you're going to run a global empire, you need to find some kind of legitimating ideology, right? And right now, that legitimating ideology is, at least in part, Islamophobia. Well,
big problem. I mean, I'm sure it was an issue. It wasn't.
I mean, I think that story of you know, of picking and choosing in a very inconsistent way is a story that runs right through till now, right? You know, America's best friends in the Middle East are the Saudi regime, right? So if American foreign policy was actually literally about something called Islamic extremism, then Saudis would be our enemies as much as the Iranians, right? But it's not actually to do with that. It's to do with geopolitics, not religious extremism, right? So going back to Afghanistan, you know, that was after the Iranian Revolution, so the Iranian version of Islamic extremism, if you want to call it, that was the enemy. But then the Afghan Mujahideen version of Islamic extremism, if you want to call it that, was our friends, right? So it's the same kind of thing. It's not really about the ideology of our alliances. It's about what those people represent politically in terms of, are they loyal to us or are they opposed to us?
It's kind of an idealist question, but have you given any thought to how to start to dispel this kind of widespread Islamophobic phenomenon that has taken over the U.S.? Do you do it from the bottom up, and do you kind of start to educate the public on the nuances of Middle Eastern politics and Islam? Or do you do it from an institutional standpoint, start to tackle the government and military policies that kind of perpetuate this idea?
Yeah, no, I don't think that's an idealist question. I think that's actually a very vital question. I mean, you know, I spent, when I was doing some of the research, I spent some time in DC with some of the advocacy groups that do try and lobby policymakers there, you know, right up to the White House. And the picture there is one in which, you know, you cannot really shift things that way, right? Or at least it's very, very difficult to do so. You know, people in the Obama administration will say that, you know, in the first few months of the Obama administration, there was the so-called underwear bomber incident, right? And for a moment in the aftermath of that, the kind of advisors in the Obama administration felt that they'd lost control of the public narrative around that incident, and that the Obama administration was getting a lot of flack for being weak in its preparation or response to that incident, right? And so they felt like they came very close to a major political disaster in which they'd have lost the narrative and lost political capital to do other things they want to do, right? So thereafter, they basically, I think, decided that they would never again allow this vulnerability on counterterrorism, right? So then you can kiss goodbye to any kind of progressive change, you know, through sitting down in meetings with Eric Holder or, you know, officials in the National Security Council who in private might be sympathetic to the arguments you're making, right? And, you know, so in that context, I think it is about a bottom-up process of change, or kind of wider cultural change, rather than a kind of lobbying and advocacy approach, right? So I think it is about building movements from the grassroots. I think it's about building alliances. You know, a lot of the experiences that I think Muslims in America face have overlaps with experiences that African Americans face, the experiences that Latinos face. So the kind of war on drugs, the war on immigration, the war on terror intersect and overlap in all kinds of ways. So that, you know, there are ways of building solidarity between people who are experiencing those different structures. You know, I think you know, there's a thing that happens sometimes where people want to say, you know, we've done enough talking, it's time for action, right? And actually, I think in a way on this, it's almost like we haven't even really begun the conversation here, right? There's a lot of these kind of questions around the relationship between, you know, our understanding of the role of ideology in terrorism is a conversation that we haven't even started to have, right? Certainly, we're beginning to have conversations here and there about some of the impacts of federal counterterrorism policy, but even that conversation is barely got going, right? So there's a lot of work of just starting to sort of say, these are the experiences that we're having, right? I think a lot of people have said, I feel like this is something that's just a post 9/11 transitory thing that will go away soon. So instead of talking about it and maybe protesting about it, I'm just going to kind of keep my head down, wave the American flag and wait for it to go away. And now we're like almost 13 years down the road and it's not gone away. So I think people now are starting to say, okay, we need to have a different strategy that's a bit more than wait, right? So I think that's an interesting moment that we're in. And we've got this national debate going on about surveillance in relation to the NSA, right? That has become, I think, an opportunity for us to say, well, we've got this slightly abstract debate about the NSA going on, which is all about what are the new mechanisms of oversight that we might introduce, but who's actually experiencing mass surveillance in America right now, right? It's, amongst others, Muslim Americans, right? I mean, it's left-wing activists, it's radical journalists maybe, but also Muslim Americans, right? Who have an experience of what it's like to live under surveillance that we haven't brought into the NSA debate, right? So it seems to me that's a conversation that we should start having, piggybacking on the NSA conversation and making it a bit more grounded and a bit more political, right? So I think there's all these different opportunities that we can start thinking about. But what I also want to pick up on what you said about surveillance, right? Actually, while it's true that it seems like the NSA collects, all of this data, right, and holds it on servers in Utah, I think it's inaccurate to say that everything we do online is being monitored. In the sense that there's someone sitting at a computer in Utah, like following what I'm typing on Facebook this afternoon, right? That actually is not the case because there just simply isn't enough intelligence analysts working in the national security apparatus to do that. What happens is that a huge amount of data is collected, right? And then intelligence analysts in the system choose to target particular individuals. And then go through the huge troves of electronic data they have to pick out, to gather a profile of that person's electronic life in a very targeted way, right? So, and we don't know at the moment from the material that we have on the NSA how exactly that targeting works, but there will be some process of targeting. So it's not true that everyone's under surveillance, right? It's actually it's a more complex picture, and one of the things about surveillance is, the part of the point of surveillance is to make us live in fear, so that we don't feel that we can express ourselves, particularly around politics, because we're under surveillance from the government, right? And so I think from that point of view, it's important that we have a sense of, while there is a kind of very dangerous system of surveillance in America, it's important that we have a sense of proportion of what that looks like, so that we don't amplify the fear beyond what is a reasonable response to the actual state of affairs, right? And this is a potential danger that, on the one hand, we have people who are saying, don't worry about surveillance because the government wouldn't spy on you unless you're doing anything wrong, so there's nothing to worry about. On the other hand, we have the other extreme, which is everyone's under surveillance all the time. The truth is actually, for most people, they're not under surveillance from the government. But for some people, maybe based on their ethnic or religious identity, maybe based on their political activism, they are under surveillance. And I think getting that complexity is important.
Just a quick question.
Sorry, we actually had a question up here.
Yeah. I was just wondering about some of if there are any class, gender, or other racial sort of dimensions. You were talking before about the construction of racism, and are African American Muslims targeted in the same way that Arab American Muslims are targeted? Are working class Muslims targeted in the same way that middle class Muslims are targeted? Are women, a part of the equation? And we just go into a bit more about that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, certainly one of the things that I looked at in the book was, what about estimates are that about a third of Muslims in America are African American, and there does seem to be some cases where the war on terror provides a kind of new lens through which to view the political activism in African American communities that would have 30 years ago been seen through the lens of COINTELPRO, which was the FBI's surveillance program on the Black Power movement and on the Black Panther Party and so forth, and that targeted those groups. And now it's the war on terror that provides an alternative lens. So one of the people that I write about is an African American Muslim preacher in Detroit called Abdullah Luqman, who was actually killed by the FBI in an operation where they'd labelled him as a kind of someone who shared an ideology with Al Qaeda, but actually he was a black nationalist who was involved in legitimate political activism. So in a way, those are cases that are kind of legacies of COINTELPRO. Around and there's a significant kind of story around social class as well in this, in the sense that if you look at what happened around about the time of 9/11, for a lot of Arab American Muslims and South Asian Muslims in America before 9/11, a lot of them had a kind of model minority kind of way of thinking about themselves, right? That that because a lot of them had come from backgrounds where they'd been their immigration to the United States was through higher education, PhD students. So a lot of them were able to enjoy quite comfortable lives in the suburbs. They had the skills that the American economy needed. That was the basis on which they were allowed to immigrate to the United States. There's a different picture from Britain, where in Britain, South Asian Muslim immigrants were being recruited to do the jobs that no one else wanted to do. So the kind of class picture is different in Britain, but here it's a much more or a significant proportion have this kind of suburban situation, and then 9/11 hits, and people are now in a very different situation where they're no longer the model minority. They are, they're the ones getting stopped at the airports. They're now being seen as the enemy, right? And so a lot of those people, my sense is that a lot of them did adopt this thing of saying, well, this seems to be a temporary state of affairs. I will keep my head down. I'll wave the American flag and wait for it to go away. And over time, that becomes less and less compelling, right? You then have a whole other story of, for every one of those people with a kind of, if you like, a kind of suburban story, there's a cab driver, the nurse, or the unemployed refugee, right? So the median income of Muslim Americans is roughly the same as the national average, right? But so the experience of those more working class communities is very different, because they bore the brunt of the kind of roundups that took place after 9/11. And so you have had a bit of a kind of disparity of experiences there, which has been one of the challenges that comes out in some of the interviews that I did, where you have small businessmen who claim to be community leaders who kind of have a very disparaging attitude towards more recent immigrants or working class parts of the community. So those issues are definitely there. And then around gender, the gender story in a way is a whole book on its own that other people who are more qualified than me have written about that question. What I would say is, one of the interesting things in, if you look at the language of counterterrorism policy in Britain, is the way that women are instrumentalized in a particular way within what's called the Preventing Violent Extremism program. So in that, women are positioned as, in a way, the kind of ideal source of intelligence, because they're seen as the heart of the home and therefore knowledgeable about everything that's happening in the family, and they're positioned as potential victims of male violence in the community, and therefore as the most likely recruits for being informants, right? So there's some very very powerful kind of ways in which gender's been constructed in these policies, right? Which intersects with all kinds of assumptions and prejudices about how these communities function, right? Yeah, I think one of the challenges is when you're building movements to try and challenge this stuff, how do you get away from a situation where just the usual suspects become the self-appointed community leaders, and those people are often going to be not working class, not women, and so you have a real issue there of how can you get more effective and nuanced forms of representation.
Just a quick question. Is there a particular Muslim group from a particular country or particular countries that is or are being targeted here in the United States in terms of the surveillance, say from Morocco, from Algeria, and why?
Well, if you look at the NYPD literature, for example, it's not so much a particular national origin, because they've kind of been systematically through all the national origins that they consider to be Muslim, right? But they do have a line of thinking around Salafi Muslims are a kind of specific group that presents a greater risk, and they don't really, the way in which they define what that might mean, what it might mean is somewhat kooky, but that does seem to inform their targeting, right? And that, I think that's true of the FBI as well. So and certainly in Britain as well, you would get a strand in the policy that sort of says there's two kinds of Muslims, Sufi and Salafi, and the Salafis are the kind of community of threat, and the Sufis are kind of peaceful, loving people, right? That kind of model. So yeah, which is kind of kooky.
That, please.
No, I'm just saying on that.
I'll hand it over to Muna. I just want to thank Arun for putting together such an incredible piece of work and spending time with us this evening, and thank Alwan for giving us the space and the time to hear from Arun tonight. So thank you so much.
It really is an incredible book. So
thank you very much. Thank you.